Mary Astell was an early modern feminist philosopher who not only engaged in debates on feminist issues, but addressed many of the leading philosophical questions of her age. She was a celebrated philosopher of her time who has since been overlooked within the history of political thought. We don't even have any surviving paintings of her, which is why the thumbnail for this video has a question mark over her portrait. As a philosopher, Astell contributed to questions of human agency, ethics, spiritual salvation, religious toleration, and constitutional debates. She's most famous for her criticisms of marriage and for proposing the establishment of a women's academy for religious and philosophical education. But her feminist views must be understood in the context of her Cartesian Platonist philosophy, her Anglicanism, and her support for the conservative Tory political party. What at first might seem a contradiction might from a different perspective be seen as an overlooked ideology of Tory or conservative feminism, which was committed to the spiritual equality of rational beings within a hierarchically ordered society. Unlike the later feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Astell was a political conservative who defended the established church and monarchy on grounds of divine right. She was a political opponent of John Locke and the Whig Party and participated in the pamphlet wars of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. In addition to being politically engaged in defense of church and queen, Astell belonged to a cohort of early modern female philosophers who were important for the reception of the writing of John Locke and René Descartes. Astell offered a vision of women's spiritual and moral education through affirming themselves as rational beings, mastering their passions, and cultivating virtue to live in accordance with God's law. I'm James Muldoon. I'm a lecturer in political science at the University of Exeter, and this is an introduction to the political thought of Mary Astell. I'd like to thank Associate Professor Teresa Bejan from the University of Oxford for her expertise and for collaborating with me on this video. If you're interested in her writings on Mary Astell, you can follow the links in the description. Estelles Life. Mary Astell was born to a gentry family with strong royalist leanings in Newcastle on 12th of November 1666. She was educated in philosophy and theology by her clergyman uncle Ralph Astell. Her father died in 1678, leaving the family in a financially precarious situation and without a dowry for his daughter. With limited possibilities at home, she made the bold decision to move to London when she was 22. In London, she came into contact with Archbishop William Sancroft, who assisted her in pursuing a career as a thinker and writer. Sancroft was among the most famous non-juring bishops in England. This meant he was expelled from the church for refusing to swear an oath of allegiance, acknowledging William and Mary as the new head of the Church of England after the Glorious Revolution. Astell's friendship with Sancroft would leave a big impression on her religious politics thereafter. After she arrived in London, Astell also started corresponding with John Norris and discussed the ideas of Nicolas Malebranche and his theory of occasionalism, the idea that God is the only true causal agent in the universe. The letters between Astell and Norris were published in 1695 as Letters Concerning the Love of God. Around this time, her writing career took off. She published her first serious proposal to the ladies in 1694, which advocated for the establishment of women's religious educational institutions. She soon followed this with a second part, which developed a method of thinking for the improvement of women's reason. After the publication of the letters and the first and second proposals, Astell achieved fame in London and was celebrated for her wit and eloquence, as well as mocked by figures like Jonathan Swift for being a female philosopher. She also gained the support of a number of female benefactors, which allowed her to pursue her career as a writer. Following the success of these texts, she published Some Reflections upon Marriage in 1700, which criticized aspects of the institution of marriage. Astell was also the author of important Tory political pamphlets and engaged in polemics against major Whig political figures. Astell was a conservative who argued against natural rights theory and John Locke's views on religious toleration. She offered the first systematic criticisms of the entire philosophy of John Locke. In 1705, she published her longest work on moral philosophy, entitled The Christian Religion as Professed by a Daughter of the Church of England. This offered an ambitious and comprehensive theory of moral and spiritual improvement, predicated on knowing one's place in society and in the order of creation. In her final years, she was involved in running a charity school for poor girls in her local neighbourhood of Chelsea in London. God and knowledge. God occupied a fundamental position in Estelle's thought because she believed a virtuous person could attain happiness and salvation by living their life in accordance with God's will as revealed through reason and scripture. Her recommendations for mental and spiritual exercises were designed to bring her female readers to the recognition of the divine gift of their intellectual faculties. In a number of her texts, she provided different justifications for the existence of God, based on both ontological and cosmological grounds. Here's one example in brief. I can imagine an infinitely perfect being. Existence would be more perfect than non-existence. Therefore, an infinitely perfect being such as God must exist. This example is called an ontological proof because it's based on grounds independent of any knowledge of reality. This style of argument had a renaissance in the 17th century with Descartes. It's not particularly compelling for modern readers, but the idea of a Christian God was crucial for her moral and political thought. Most of Estelle's readers would have been Christian anyway, so proving God's existence wasn't her main aim. Estelle's metaphysics could be placed broadly in the camp of Cartesian dualism, which was opposed to materialists like Hobbes, who believed that all reality could ultimately be reduced to physical matter in motion. Astell was a dualist who thought that there was two kinds of being, minds and bodies, with different degrees of finitude. God, for example, was an infinite mind, whereas human minds and human bodies were naturally finite beings. She believed that the mind had entirely different properties to the body and could be viewed as a completely independent entity. The Cartesian view of all human beings as rational creatures supported her feminist argument that any inequality between men and women was a product of education rather than women's natural inferiority. But she differed from Descartes on several key points. First, she denied that we are born with certain innate ideas, and her theory of knowledge was actually closer to St. Augustine's illuminationist theory of the human mind. On this view, we are only capable of understanding ideas by means of the divine light of God. Her theory of knowledge was a synthesis of Cartesian philosophy with the writings of St. Augustine and Neoplatonism, similar to her contemporaries such as Nicolas Malebranche and John Norris. The Platonic aspects of her thought are often overlooked, but she believed that God's creatures were ordered on a hierarchical scale of creation. The goal of rational souls was to practice their virtue in order to ascend their way up the hierarchy back to the source of perfection, which was God. Descartes' influence is most evident in her conception of clear and distinct ideas and her theory of regulating the passions. First, she had a rationalist epistemology and denied that our senses could be trusted as a reliable source to the truth. Instead, she considered Descartes' notion of clear and distinct ideas that could be grasped by a rational mind as a more solid foundation for knowledge. This informed her feminism, which was based on the idea that only human bodies were sexed, human minds were not, and so men and women were rational and spiritual equals. Second, she was also influenced by Descartes' idea that we must learn to moderate and control our passions. Emotions such as pride and vanity often get in the way of our search for the truth. She therefore encouraged her readers to consider their souls as thinking substances, distinct from their bodies, that were capable of attaining mastery over bodily sensations. For Astell, there was an intimate connection between truth and virtue. Ignorance was what disposed us to sin, and a more rigorous method of thinking would help us in acting virtuously. She advised us to turn our minds away from the sensible world of material things and towards quiet, intellectual contemplation. She thought that many of us were most attracted to playing games, gossip, and intrigue. But acquiring truth and virtue for Estelle would involve turning away from this sensuous world. Instead, she thought we should surround ourselves with books and virtuous friends, capable of edifying conversations about God. Her practical proposals for living a more virtuous life were particularly directed to her fellow women. She advocated a feminist practice of self-love, whereby women should reject the negative depictions of them by society and affirm themselves as rational beings. She thought that female friendships could be the basis of women helping each other to live more virtuous lives, and that there was a place for a women-only religious retreat where they would have time and space to devote themselves to philosophical thought and discussion. All the learned ladies. In her essay A Serious Proposal, Estelle criticized the limited opportunities available for women's self-improvement. Because women were financially and legally dependent on men, their futures relied entirely on whatever proposals, whether serious or not, men might make to them. Estelle rejected this situation for women and wrote her own serious proposal to the ladies. Wealthy women who didn't intend to marry should use their dowries to finance religious women's colleges. In other words, she wanted to construct the institutional basis of women's intellectual emancipation from ignorance and social subordination. The current problem for Estelle was that women were conditioned to place value on their looks, clothing, and manners, rather than on their more valuable rational faculties. To cultivate their sense of self-worth, women should be permitted to study philosophy and religion. The religious component of this proposal was important, because she didn't argue that women should acquire knowledge for its own sake. Rather, she thought that this type of activity would enable them to use their reason to know God and acquire happiness in this life and the next. As a Christian, she believed that we had a duty to live in accordance with God's law, but she was also heavily influenced by Platonist theory and believed that we should develop a disposition to obey the law through the cultivation of virtue. Virtue consists in the soul gaining mastery over the passions and developing the kind of character that is habitually disposed to act morally. For Estelle, the most important virtues were benevolence, generosity, and friendship, which were all closely associated with Christian teachings. She thought that we should put others first and wish them well purely for the sake of promoting their own well-being, rather than for self-interested reasons. Rational obedience was thus for Estelle the crowning virtue of a rational being. One of the values she saw in a female academy was that it would allow virtuous friendships to flourish between women. These friends would be able to encourage each other on their intellectual journeys towards understanding and performing their obligations. There were plans for funding Estelle's proposal, but it never really got off the ground, possibly due to the fact that in a predominantly Protestant country, it sounded very close to a Catholic nunnery. This was due in part to Estelle's own PR failure in describing her academy as a monastery. Reflections on Marriage. In Reflections on Marriage, Estelle provided a careful analysis of the most common causes of marital discontent in her time. The text was written in response to a famous case of a duke's tyranny over his wife, and became a popular work that was reprinted several times during Estelles' lifetime. She didn't call for the abolition of marriage, and still viewed it as a sacred institution ordained by God. Her problem lay with how the institution was often treated, particularly by men. She warned women to be wary of marriage because many men choose to marry for selfish motives and expect blind submission from their wives. They proposed marriage for their own good without any thought for the good of the marriage and their partner. Estelle thought that there were so many unhappy marriages because women were not allowed to exercise their reason or gain a proper education in religion and philosophy that would allow them to evaluate proposals properly. She argued that women ought to be well educated to allow them to choose their husbands wisely or to not marry at all if they so desired. She was critical of the widespread idea that women had no other options aside from marriage. But in this text, Estelle also claimed that once a woman does decide to marry, she should accept the authority of her husband and obey his commands. It's a curious read for contemporary feminists because it combines ridicule of abusive male partners with arguments for traditional gender norms and patriarchal power. Her main purpose in writing the text was to get her female readers to critically reflect on whether they should marry and to consider the possibility that a different course in life might be open to them. High Church Toryism. The same curious combination of informed consent and passive obedience characterized Estelle's politics. Estelle began to publish political pamphlets in 1704 in response to the debate then raging in England about occasional conformity. Defenders of occasional conformity argued that religious dissenters should still be allowed to hold office and participate in politics by taking communion in an Anglican church once a year, even if they didn't believe in its tenets. These beliefs included the idea that the King or Queen of England was the rightful head of the established Church of England. Whig proponents of occasional conformity argued that it was an essential part of religious toleration in a society like England, which tolerated all sorts of religious dissent, even though it was officially Anglican. But this argument absolutely horrified Astell, who saw occasional conformity as a cynical and hypocritical ploy by enemies of the Church of England to weaken the national church while getting themselves in positions of power. Astell argued, following Machiavelli, that national churches were essential to civic virtue. But she also argued the High Church Tory line on feminist grounds. Whig support for occasional conformity was, she argued, a conspiracy to undermine the authority of Queen Anne, who had risen to the throne as the natural daughter of James, the very monarch who had been overthrown by William and Mary, her older sister, during the Glorious Revolution. Like Archbishop Sancroft, Astell thought that the sanctity of an individual's conscience as a gift from God was cheapened by the demand that she swear oath after oath every time the regime changed, which amounted to little more than a series of false promises. What's interesting for modern political philosophy is that Astell turned this conservative opposition to occasional conformity into a searing critique of social contract theory, then popular among English Whigs at the time. Foremost among the Whig social contract theorists was John Locke, who argued in the Second Treatise of Government that all men were naturally free and equal, and therefore that legitimate government must rest on and be limited by the consent of the governed. In her 1706 preface to the third edition of Reflections on Marriage, Astell skewered Locke's argument on feminist grounds. To quote, "If all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves? As they must be if the being subjected to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of men be the perfect condition of slavery." In pointing out the conspicuous absence of women from Locke's social contract, Astell was revealing the Whig emphasis on consent to be a hypocritical charade. Consent only matters to men when they happen to dislike the government. But these same men, Astell pointed out, were perfectly happy to tyrannize over their wives. But Astell wasn't trying to argue that patriarchal marriage, as it existed in her time, was unjust. On the contrary, she saw marriage much like monarchy and episcopal churches, instituted by God himself by divine right. The only difference was that women were not born into marriages. Rather, like men, they were in a position to designate their chosen spouse when consenting to the marriage contract. The same was not true of those who were born under the power of a particular monarch. Much like Locke's great enemy Robert Filmer, Astell argued that Queen Anne was the queen not because anyone had consented to her authority, but because she was placed in her position of authority by God as the legitimate heir of King James. She thus had a natural duty to command, just as those placed as subjects under her had a natural duty to obey. Whether or not they swore an oath conveying their express consent to her authority was immaterial. Rational obedience from those who understood why they were obligated to obey was in Estelle's mind the highest virtue. It isn't surprising then that while many modern feminists appreciate Estelle's critique of Lockean social contract theory, they don't really care for Estelle's politics. Still, one shouldn't doubt Estelle's commitment to her argument for the natural equality of men and women as rational beings. She was a particularly savage critic of the sexist assumption that because wives were subject to their husbands, then women as a whole should be seen as inferior to men. To quote her, that the custom of the world has put women, generally speaking, into a state of subjection is not denied. But the right can no more be proved from the fact that the predominancy of vice can justify it. Because God made all things for himself, the service she at any time becomes obliged to pay to a man is only a business by the by, just as it may be any man's business and duty to keep hogs. He was not made for this, but if he hires himself out to such an employment, he ought conscientiously to perform it. Consider this the 18th century version of Men are Pigs. Estelle clearly hoped that by establishing a women's academy, she could save herself and her sisters from the necessity of such degrading employment.